My name is Paige William, and I am 36 years old. 14 years ago, my father introduced my brother to a room full of Chicago corporate executives with a single crushing sentence. He pointed to him and said, "This is the one we are proud of." I was standing right next to them. His colleagues glanced at me and shifted their weight in discomfort. I extended my hand and introduced myself by my job title. My father looked at me like a nuisance he needed to sweep away. 14 years later, one of those exact executives reached out to me for a very specific professional reason. He was begging my firm for a lifeline to save my father from financial ruin. He had no idea the woman he was emailing was the same humiliated girl from that night. Before I tell you what I did when they walked into my boardroom, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Eva Tells Stories, but only if you believe in demanding the respect you deserve. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the winter of 2012, the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a ballroom packed with the city elite. In this town, your job title is your identity. You are measured by your portfolio and the cut of your fabric. I was 22 years old, wearing a clearance rack blazer that pulled tight across the shoulders. Beside me stood my brother Connor. He was 24, wearing a bespoke suit our father had purchased for him the week before. My father, Richard William, was a commercial real estate developer. He navigated the room with the ease of a man who assumed everyone wanted his time. He stopped to shake hands with Harrison Sterling, a venture capitalist known for making or breaking companies. My father clapped Connor on the shoulder. His chest swelled with pride. "Harrison," he said, his voice carrying over the low hum of the string quartet. "This is my son Connor. Just got his MBA. He is the one we are proud of." Harrison smiled and offered a firm handshake. Then his eyes drifted to me. The quiet stretched thin and awkward. My father did not offer my name. He did not acknowledge my presence. I was treated like the staff waiting to clear their empty glasses. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I refused to look at the floor. I stepped forward, forcing Harrison to address me. I extended my hand and kept my voice level. "I am Paige, junior financial analyst." Harrison offered a weak, pitying smile and shook my hand. My father shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass. How dare I speak? How dare I assert my own existence in his orbit? The conversation moved on, and I faded back into the periphery. But later that night, walking to the train in the bitter Chicago wind, I stopped shivering. I looked up at the towering skyscrapers piercing the dark sky. My father viewed his children as assets, and he had made it clear I offered zero return. I made a promise to myself right there on the icy pavement. I would not just earn a seat at their table. I would buy the building and sell the chairs they sat on. I just needed time. What I did not know was that my father was already laying the foundation for his own downfall, and the next time I asked him for help, he would hand me the match. To understand how I ended up standing invisible at the Drake Hotel, you have to understand the architecture of the William family hierarchy. My father Richard did not merely work in commercial real estate. He treated his entire existence like a balance sheet. Every relationship functioned as a transaction. Every interaction required a calculated yield. We were not raised as siblings in a nurturing home. We were managed as competing subsidiaries in his personal corporate portfolio. Connor was the golden boy. He represented the flagship asset. Spring of 2008 arrived and college acceptance letters appeared in our mailbox in thick, glossy envelopes. Connor gained admission to a prestigious private university on the North Shore. His high school grades were mediocre at best, but my father had made strategic donations to the alumni fund to smooth the path. The afternoon Connor received his acceptance letter, my father handed him the keys to a brand new silver BMW. I remember the sharp smell of fresh leather when Connor opened the door. My father clapped him on the back. He announced that his son needed reliable transportation so he would not stress about commuting. A future executive, he declared, needs to ride in comfort to maintain focus. 2 weeks later, my own letter arrived. I earned acceptance into the University of Illinois at Chicago through sheer academic force and relentless studying. I brought the letter to my father in his study. He sat behind his polished oak desk, surrounded by framed awards and photographs that featured Connor prominently. He glanced at the university crest on my paper. He did not offer a smile. He did not suggest a celebration dinner. Instead, he pulled open his bottom drawer and withdrew a thick stack of federal student loan applications. He pushed a heavy silver pen across the desk toward me. "You need to learn grit, Paige," he told me. His voice sounded sterile and detached. "I am doing you a favor. Nothing builds character like carrying your own weight." He signed nothing. He offered zero financial assistance. That was the first overlapping conflict. The glaring financial double standard dictated every aspect of our lives. I signed those papers. I took on the crushing debt. I enrolled in a full course load of finance and economics, but tuition accounted for only a fraction of the equation. Chicago operates as an unforgiving landscape. Rent, food, transit passes, and textbooks drained my meager savings instantly. To survive, I secured a position as a paralegal clerk at a mid-sized corporate law firm downtown. I worked 40 hours a week, sorting through thousands of pages of dense legal jargon. I balanced that grueling schedule with 15 credit hours. My alarm buzzed at 4 in the morning every single day. I slept maybe 4 hours a night. I drank cheap break room coffee until my hands shook just to stay awake through my afternoon lectures. I rode the CTA Blue Line in the dead of winter, shivering in a thin thrift store coat. I studied accounting principles under the flickering train lights while the bitter wind off Lake Michigan rattled the windows. While I was memorizing tax codes on a crowded train, Connor treated his university experience like an extended luxury vacation. During his sophomore year, the cracks in his academic facade began to show. I was visiting the house one weekend to use the laundry machines when I overheard shouting radiating from my father's study. Connor had failed 3 core business classes. He lingered on the verge of academic probation. If he failed one more course, the university would expel him. A normal parent might have grounded their child. A normal parent might have told their son to learn grit. My father did the exact opposite. He pulled out his checkbook. He hired elite private tutors charging $300 an hour to salvage Connor's grade point average. He paid graduate students to essentially rewrite Connor's term papers. He threw money at the problem until the academic threat vanished. I stood in the hallway holding a basket of clean clothes, listening to my father assure Connor that the setback was just a minor hurdle. That was the boulder. The heavy, suffocating realization pinned me to the floor in that hallway. My father did not view us as equal children. He viewed us as distinct asset classes. Connor was his legacy project. Connor was the brand name that needed protection, regardless of performance. I was a liability. I was an investment that required too much capital for a meager return. In my father's eyes, funding my education meant throwing money away because he had already determined my ceiling. He decided I possessed no return on investment. But here's the secret about the Chicago grind. It strips away your illusions and hardens your spine. You either let the city crush you, or you let it forge you into steel. I chose steel. While Connor learned how to network at exclusive country club bars on our father's dime, buying rounds of drinks to mask his incompetence, I learned something far more dangerous. The paralegal job granted me unrestricted access to the inner workings of corporate America. I spent my nights staring at complex financial disclosures, merger agreements, and bankruptcy filings. I organized documents for senior partners dealing in distressed debt and mezzanine financing. At 2 in the morning, while my brother slept off his hangovers in a luxury apartment paid for by our father, I was decoding the exact mechanisms companies used to hide their debt. I learned how to spot a failing asset. I learned how to identify the subtle red flags in a balance sheet that signaled impending ruin. I taught myself the language of money. I taught myself how power moved through corporate contracts. I realized that wealth relied on leverage, and leverage required hidden knowledge. My father thought he was punishing me by forcing me to claw my way through the dirt. He thought he was teaching me a lesson in humility. He had no idea he was handing me the very tools I would eventually use to dismantle his empire. The disparity between my brother's manufactured success and my raw survival became the fuel that drove me forward. I stopped seeking my father's approval and started studying his methods. I absorbed every detail of how the business world operated from the shadows. I watched senior partners negotiate hostile takeovers and noted their tactics. I recognized that emotion served as a weakness in the boardroom. I knew the breaking point was approaching. I could feel the physical and mental tension stretching thinner with every passing month. I ran on fumes, pushing my body past its natural limits just to keep a roof over my head and my tuition paid. I thought I could outrun the exhaustion. I believed sheer willpower would sustain me until graduation day. But the human body keeps a meticulous ledger. My body prepared to collect on the debt I owed it. A severe physical crisis loomed on the horizon. When it finally struck, it would strip away my remaining strength and force me back into my father's pristine office for a final devastating confrontation. The human body operates much like a corporate balance sheet. You can defer maintenance for years, but eventually the accumulated debt comes due. 6 months after that humiliating evening at the Drake Hotel, my physical ledger demanded immediate payment. I was sitting in the law firm break room staring at a towering stack of merger documents when a sudden blinding pain tore through my right side. It was not a subtle warning. It felt like a serrated blade twisting just below my ribs. I collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor, gasping for air, while a senior associate dropped his coffee and yelled for someone to call an ambulance. I woke up hours later in a sterile recovery room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. A surgeon with a tired smile informed me that my appendix had been dangerously close to rupturing. They performed an emergency appendectomy. The physical procedure went flawlessly, but the financial aftermath did not. My basic university health insurance covered the bulk of the surgical costs, but left me holding a heavy burden of out-of-pocket expenses. The hospital billing department presented me with an invoice for $4,000. In the elite circles of Chicago real estate, $4,000 pays for a single night of bottle service at a premium club. In my world, it equaled 3 months of rent. Worse than the medical debt was the enforced recovery period. The doctors mandated 3 weeks of strict bed rest to prevent tearing my stitches. For a student working an hourly wage as a paralegal clerk, missing 3 weeks of shifts triggered a catastrophic financial cascade. My paycheck stopped immediately. My savings account, already depleted by expensive textbooks and daily transit cards, hit zero within days. 15 days after my hospital discharge, a printed notice appeared taped to the door of my studio apartment. Pay your rent within 5 days or face immediate eviction. The math offered no mercy. I possessed no assets to liquidate, and no credit history to secure a standard bank loan. I had spent the last several years actively avoiding my father. I preferred the grueling exhaustion of financial independence over the toxic strings attached to his wealth. But pride cannot negotiate with a landlord. Facing the genuine prospect of sleeping on a park bench in late October, I drafted a comprehensive repayment plan. I built a detailed spreadsheet outlining my projected future income, my essential living expenses, and a realistic timeline to pay back $4,000 plus a 5% interest rate. I printed the proposal, placed it in a clean manila folder, and boarded the train toward the Loop. My father ran his development empire from the top floor of a sleek glass tower on Wacker Drive. The reception area featured imported Italian marble and panoramic views of the Chicago River. The administrative assistant, a woman whose silk blouse cost more than my entire seasonal wardrobe, asked me to take a seat. I sat on a pristine leather sofa, clutching my folder while my surgical incisions continued to throb underneath my cheap thrift store sweater. I waited for 45 minutes before she finally ushered me into the inner sanctum. Richard Williams sat behind a desk the size of a dining table. He did not rise when I entered the room. He merely gestured toward one of the rigid guest chairs opposite him. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with his tie loosened just enough to signal that he had been executing high-level deals all morning. He looked at me with the same detached scrutiny he reserved for problematic zoning permits. "You look pale, Paige," he observed, resting his elbows on the polished wood. I explained the situation concisely. I removed all emotion from my voice. I outlined the ruptured appendix, the unexpected hospital stay, the lost wages, and the impending eviction notice. I slid the manila folder across the vast expanse of his desk. "I am asking for a loan," I told him, keeping my gaze locked on his. $4,000. This is a detailed amortization schedule. I will repay you in monthly installments with interest. I will not miss a single payment." My father did not open the folder. He did not even glance at the meticulously calculated spreadsheet I had stayed up all night creating. Instead, he leaned back in his leather executive chair and steepled his fingers together. He let the silence stretch out, forcing me to sit in my own desperation. "Paige," he began, utilizing his slow, measured boardroom cadence. "Business is about return on investment. It requires assessing risk and evaluating potential yields. You are an entry-level clerk drowning in student debt. You possess no collateral and zero market leverage." He tapped his index finger against the closed cover of my folder. "What is my ROI on bailing you out?" I stared at him. The words hung in the air, chilling the entire room. He was not talking to his daughter who had just survived emergency surgery. He was evaluating a distressed asset and deciding to let it fail. "I am your child," I whispered, the profound betrayal slipping through my professional facade despite my best efforts. He let out a heavy, performative exhale of disappointment. "You wanted independence," he replied. "You chose a public university. You chose to work a low-tier job. This is the reality of the path you selected. Bailing you out teaches you nothing. It reinforces poor planning. I am doing you a favor by letting you face the consequences of your financial fragility." He slid the folder back across the desk. It stopped inches from my hand. "Learn from this experience, Paige. Next time, build a safety net." I did not argue. I did not beg. I picked up my folder, stood up, and walked out of his office. The pain in my abdomen flared with every step, but I kept my spine rigidly straight until the elevator doors closed, shielding me from view. I rode down 40 floors in silence. I stepped out onto Wacker Drive and let the frigid autumn wind hit my face. I secured a predatory payday loan that afternoon to keep my apartment, accepting an astronomical interest rate that would keep me impoverished for another 2 years. I survived the month. The true devastation arrived 48 hours later. I sat in a cheap diner, nursing a cup of black coffee, trying to calculate my new austere budget. A discarded copy of Crane's Chicago Business lay on the table next to me. The prominent headline on page 3 caught my eye. "Richard William backs next generation tech venture." I read the article and my heart stopped beating. My father had just provided $500,000 in seed funding for a new software startup. The founder and chief executive officer of this unproven hypothetical company was my brother Connor. Connor possessed zero coding experience. He held a mediocre business degree that our father essentially bought for him. He had never managed a payroll, never built a viable product, and never demonstrated a single shred of entrepreneurial talent. Yet my father handed him $500,000 of capital without blinking an eye. The article featured a direct quote from Richard William himself. "Connor represents the future of innovative leadership. Funding this venture provides an immeasurable return on investment for our family legacy." That printed quote was the boulder that crushed every lingering illusion I harbored. $4,000 to save his daughter from homelessness represented a poor investment. $500,000 thrown into a vanity project for his incompetent son represented a legacy. The sheer audacity of the hypocrisy severed the last frayed thread connecting me to that family. I sat in the diner staring at the glossy page, and I realized I had been playing the wrong game my entire life. I wanted to be loved. My father only understood leverage. I folded the newspaper and left it on the table. I walked back to my cramped apartment. I did not shed a single tear. Crying requires the belief that someone might care about your sorrow, and I knew definitively that no one in my bloodline did. I gathered a cardboard box and packed up every photograph, every holiday card, every tiny useless memento tying me to the William name. I carried the box to the alley behind my building and dropped it into the dumpster. The next morning, I walked into a mobile carrier store and changed my phone number. I did not send a forwarding address to anyone. I updated my emergency contacts at the law firm, removing my father's name and replacing it with a blank line. I executed a permanent, unannounced severing of ties. They wanted to treat me like a write-off, so I wrote them out of my existence. I prepared to sink into the deepest shadows of the Chicago corporate machinery to build my own armor. I needed to forge myself into something untouchable. To do that, I needed to find a mentor who fed on the exact same ruthless energy that ruled this city. I needed someone who recognized predators. And a few years later, on a cutthroat trading floor, I found exactly who I was looking for. Chicago private equity does not care about your feelings. It operates as a sophisticated meat grinder designed to chew up weakness and spit out profit. When I walked into the lobby of Sterling and Vance Capital on my first day as a junior analyst, I carried two things. I had a degree from a state school and a singular, unyielding desire to succeed. The bullpen was a sea of navy blue suits and Ivy League pedigrees. Young men with generational wealth stood around the espresso machines discussing their weekends at exclusive golf courses and sailing clubs. I possessed none of those advantages. My father had ensured I started at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. So I decided to outwork every single person in that building. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning. By 5, I sat at my desk cross-referencing financial models before the heating system even clicked on. I stayed until 10 at night eating stale vending machine sandwiches while the Harvard graduates left at 6 for networking dinners. The industry thrives on an unspoken hierarchy. Your title dictates your worth and your background dictates your title. The senior vice presidents routinely handed me towering stacks of unorganized data, expecting me to find the discrepancies they were too lazy to locate. They assumed I would remain a silent worker bee. They took my research, slapped their names on the executive summaries, and presented my findings to the board. I swallowed the frustration because I knew complaining would label me as emotional. In this sector, being labeled an emotional woman equates to a career death sentence. I needed an opening. I needed a moment to prove my undeniable value to someone holding actual power. That opening arrived in the form of Sylvia Thorne. Sylvia operated as the sole female senior partner at the firm. She was 60 years old and possessed a reputation so formidable that even the most arrogant managing directors straightened their ties when she walked into a room. She demanded perfection and fired people who offered excuses instead of solutions. Most junior analysts avoided her floor entirely. I sought it out. During a brutal acquisition of a distressed manufacturing firm, the executive team pushed to close the deal by Friday. 3 senior vice presidents reviewed the target company's liability disclosures and greenlit the purchase. They missed something critical. I found the discrepancy at 2 in the morning on a Thursday. My eyes burned from staring at dual monitors, but the numbers refused to align. The target company had buried a pending environmental penalty within a maze of subsidiary shell corporations. It amounted to a $2 million blind spot. If our firm absorbed that asset, we would swallow the penalty. I did not take the finding to the vice presidents, who would undoubtedly claim the discovery as their own. I printed the specific addendums, highlighted the exact routing of the hidden debt, and walked straight to Sylvia Thorne's corner office. She sat behind her desk, reviewing documents under the glow of a single brass lamp. She did not look up when I knocked on her open door. "State your business," she commanded. I walked in and placed the highlighted file directly over the document she was reading. "We are about to inherit a $2 million environmental fine," I told her, keeping my voice devoid of hesitation. The VP team missed a liability shelter in the third addendum. Sylvia finally raised her head. She scrutinized my face, searching for any sign of uncertainty. She picked up the file and read through my highlighted sections in silence. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the vast office. After 5 minutes, she closed the folder. She looked at me with a calculating, sharp gaze. "You bypassed your direct supervisors to bring this to me," she noted. I held my ground. "My direct supervisors care about closing bonuses," I replied. "I care about the integrity of the acquisition." Sylvia leaned back in her chair. A rare, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "You have ice in your veins, Paige," she said. "Use it." The next morning, Sylvia halted the acquisition during a full board meeting. She publicly dismantled the 3 vice presidents who had neglected to perform proper due diligence. Then she pointed directly to me, sitting in the back row taking minutes. She announced that my meticulous financial dissection had just saved the firm a disastrous public failure. From that day forward, I no longer answered to the bullpen. Sylvia transferred me to her direct team. Sylvia became the mentor my father refused to be. She did not care about my lack of a trust fund or my state school background. She only valued my competence. We spent countless evenings poring over distressed asset portfolios, sharing takeout containers, while she taught me the intricate psychology of high-stakes negotiation. She became my chosen family. She taught me how to read a room, how to identify a desperate seller, and how to structure a deal that left the opponent thinking they had won while I walked away with the actual leverage. Under her strict guidance, my trajectory shifted from a grueling crawl to a vertical climb. I advanced from analyst to associate in record time. 2 years later, I secured the title of junior partner. But as my profile within the firm grew, I made a highly strategic choice. I realized that keeping the surname William would eventually draw the attention of my father and his network. I needed to build my empire in the shadows, untethered from his toxic legacy. I legally altered my professional registration. I began operating exclusively under my first and middle name, Paige Elise. I instructed the marketing department to omit my photograph from the firm's public website. I scrubbed my digital footprint. To the outside world, Paige Elise existed as a brilliant, faceless entity, securing lucrative buyouts across the Midwest. To my biological family, Paige William had simply vanished into the ether. While I quietly accumulated real wealth and undeniable influence, my brother Connor lived his life loudly and foolishly. I kept tabs on the William family by monitoring public financial filings and industry gossip. Connor treated his new tech startup like a personal piggy bank. He burned through our father's seed funding within a year. He possessed no viable product, no user base, and no sustainable revenue model. Instead of recognizing the failure and cutting his losses, my father doubled down. He allowed his pride to dictate his strategy. I watched the disaster unfold from the safety of my high-rise office. My father leveraged the equity in his prime commercial real estate to inject more capital into Connor's sinking ship. He was terrified of the social embarrassment that would accompany his golden child's public failure. They were throwing gasoline onto a raging financial inferno. Their house of cards swayed dangerously in the wind, held together only by predatory loans and desperate optimism. They believed they could bluff their way out of insolvency. They assumed their elite status would shield them from ruin. But the Chicago market does not respect status. It only respects leverage. And the moment their final line of credit snapped, I knew exactly who the banking sector would call to liquidate the ashes. The collision was imminent, and I held all the water. Let us cut to 10 years later. I am 32 years old. My name sits etched into the frosted glass doors of a premier private equity firm on LaSalle Street, Thorne and Elise Capital. Sylvia kept her promise. When she decided to rebrand and expand her operations, she elevated me to full managing partner. We operate as apex predators in the financial ecosystem. We specialize in distressed asset acquisitions. In the Chicago market, distressed asset acquisition requires a clinical detachment from human sentiment. We buy failing companies. We step into boardrooms where executives are sweating through their custom shirts. We gut the operational rot, we fire the incompetent management teams, and we restructure the debt until the entity becomes profitable again. You cannot care about the legacy of a 100-year-old manufacturing plant when the ledger shows a terminal cash bleed. You only care about the math. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not play favorites. I bought a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. I paid the asking price entirely in cash. I stand on my balcony at night watching the headlights stream along DuSable Lakeshore Drive, feeling the hum of the city beneath my feet. I no longer ride the transit trains shivering in a thin coat. I wear tailored suits woven from Italian wool. I drink vintage wine poured by sommeliers who know my name. But the hunger that drove me out of my father's office never vanished. It merely evolved into a sharper, colder instrument. I built my own table from scratch, and I control every seat. I never reached out to my biological family, but I never looked away either. In my line of work, keeping tabs on local corporate entities qualifies as standard market research. The William family generated plenty of public financial filings. It became a quiet ritual of mine to brew a cup of black coffee on Sunday mornings and review the latest public disclosures regarding Connor and his flagship enterprise. I watched the disaster unfold with the detached fascination of a meteorologist tracking a hurricane. My father's golden child was currently orchestrating a catastrophic failure. The tech startup he launched with that initial seed funding produced nothing of value. It possessed a vague mission statement about synergistic networking solutions. In reality, it served as a vanity project designed to manufacture the illusion of entrepreneurship. Connor lacked the discipline required to build a sustainable revenue model. He spent his operating budget on sleek downtown office spaces, catered lunches, and exorbitant consulting fees paid to his fraternity brothers. He bought ping-pong tables and luxury espresso machines, while his developers produced unusable code. When the initial product failed to attract a single paying client, Connor pivoted. He rebranded the company as an artificial intelligence integration platform. That maneuver burned through another huge round of funding. When the AI sector proved too complex for his limited intellect, he pivoted a third time into blockchain logistics. Each pivot required fresh capital. Each pivot accelerated the cash burn rate to a staggering degree. The numbers told a story of a ship taking on water faster than the pumps could operate. A rational investor cuts their losses when the data indicates a terminal trajectory. My father, Richard William, was not acting as a rational investor. In the elite circles of Chicago high society, perception dictates reality. Admitting that his son squandered millions of dollars would require admitting a personal failure in judgment. My father built his entire reputation on identifying lucrative opportunities. He spent his weekends at exclusive golf clubs boasting about his brilliant son. Letting Connor fail publicly would shatter the infallible William dynasty facade. His peers would smell the weakness. So my father chose denial. He decided to subsidize the illusion. I watched the county property records update in real time. To inject fresh liquidity into Connor's sinking vessel, my father mortgaged two of his most valuable commercial properties in the West Loop. These were foundational assets. They were buildings that generated the stable passive income, sustaining his lavish lifestyle. He leveraged prime real estate to secure predatory mezzanine loans and funneled that cash directly into Connor's failing corporate accounts. He cannibalized his own hard-earned empire to feed a black hole. This dynamic produced moments of dark irony. One Tuesday evening, I sat in my penthouse reviewing a particularly disastrous quarterly report from Connor's firm. Their debt-to-income ratio had crossed into fatal territory. They were drowning in short-term liabilities, unable to cover payroll without another cash injection. I took a break from the spreadsheet and opened a social media application on my phone. The algorithm fed me an update from Connor's public profile. He had posted a photograph just an hour earlier. He stood on the deck of a chartered yacht in Miami, holding a bottle of vintage champagne. He wore designer sunglasses and a smug, confident smile. Several young women posed behind him holding expensive cocktails. The caption read, "Grinding hard, building the future, never stop innovating." I stared at the screen. That was a classic Pebble moment. A small, quiet realization of profound absurdity that hits you right in the chest. Connor popped champagne on a rented boat, blissfully oblivious to the fact that his company was mathematically dead. He believed he was a titan of industry because our father shielded him from the consequences of his own ineptitude. He played the role of a successful founder while our father quietly drained his own retirement funds to pay the marina fees. Connor possessed no resilience because he never experienced the friction of reality. When you insulate a golden child from failure, you do not protect them. You leave them entirely defenseless against the eventual collapse of their artificial ecosystem. My father believed he was securing a legacy, but he was merely funding a prolonged execution. He risked his decades of real estate triumphs, his prestige, his personal wealth just to prevent his son from feeling inadequate. The father who once told me to learn grit was shielding his son from ever learning a single lesson. The situation escalated beyond a simple bad investment. It transformed into financial suicide. The commercial mortgages carried aggressive interest rates. If Connor's company could not generate substantial returns to service that debt, the banks would foreclose on my father's foundational properties. Once the dominoes began to fall, the panic would spread to his other creditors. The entire William estate balanced precariously on the brink of total insolvency. They were hiding their panic behind country club smiles and tailored suits, but the math was coming for them. They were driving a luxury vehicle straight toward a sheer financial cliff, pressing the accelerator to the floor while arguing over the radio station. They felt invincible because they mistook borrowed time for permanent security. I sat in my quiet sky-high living room, watching the digital metrics of their impending ruin. I did not intervene. I did not send a warning. I operated in the competitive world of distressed assets, and I recognized a terminal balance sheet when I saw one. I stood at the bottom of the canyon, watching the tires slip over the edge. I just had to wait patiently for gravity to do its job. I was ready to catch the broken pieces. 14 years have passed since that freezing night outside the Drake Hotel. I am 36 years old. It is a Tuesday morning in late October. Chicago rain lashes against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office on LaSalle Street. The weather mirrors the relentless, unforgiving nature of the financial sector I now command. I sit in a custom ergonomic chair drinking espresso imported from a boutique roaster in Colombia. My suit is bespoke, tailored to project authority and quiet dominance. I have spent over a decade meticulously constructing an impenetrable fortress of wealth and reputation. I am managing partner Elise. I own the room. I own the view. I dictate the terms. I open my encrypted corporate email client. Sorting through the overnight correspondence usually requires clinical detachment. I scan requests for capital injections, preliminary merger outlines, and desperate pleas from sinking executives. In my line of work, desperation presents itself in formal typography and carefully sanitized attachments. I process the data with the emotionless precision Sylvia taught me. Then my eyes catch a specific sender name on the fourth line of my inbox. Harrison Sterling. A profound chill settles into my chest. My hand freezes over the sleek glass surface of my trackpad. The bustling noise of the trading floor outside my heavy oak door fades into a muted hum. 14 years compress into a single fraction of a second. I am suddenly 22 again, wearing that cheap clearance rack blazer, extending my hand, while my father looks at me with undisguised contempt. I remember Harrison Sterling's face vividly. I remember the uncomfortable pity in his eyes when my father introduced Connor as the pride of the family and treated me like a ghost. Harrison Sterling, the heavy-hitting venture capitalist who witnessed my ultimate public humiliation. I click the subject line. It reads Confidential Acquisition Opportunity, Strategic Restructuring. I read the text with forensic scrutiny. Harrison is writing to my professional moniker. Dear partner Elise, he begins. His tone is reverent deferential. He praises the aggressive market maneuvers Thorne and Elise Capital executed over the previous 2 quarters. He strokes my ego using the polished language of a man who needs a favor from a superior predator. He states that his firm is currently brokering a discreet buyout for a technology venture facing temporary liquidity challenges. He claims the intellectual property holds significant potential for the right private equity buyer willing to overlook short-term cash flow disruptions. In the distressed asset sector, we translate that corporate jargon instantly. Temporary liquidity challenges translates to they cannot make payroll. Short-term cash flow disruptions means they are bleeding capital at a terminal velocity. Harrison is trying to dress up a corpse and sell it as a sleeping beauty. I scroll down to the target company details. The text blurs for a moment before snapping into sharp, undeniable focus. The failing venture he is desperately trying to offload is Connor's startup. The sheer poetic irony of the situation forces me to push my chair away from the desk. I stand up and walk to the rain-streaked glass looking out over the gray skyline. Harrison Sterling is acting as the distressed broker for my brother. My father, Richard William, has utilized every connection in his elite country club network to find a savior for his golden child. He has enlisted the exact same venture capitalist he tried to impress 14 years ago to quietly shop this disaster around the financial district. They are running out of air. They are drowning, and they are blindly throwing life preservers into the dark. The most staggering element of this entire scenario is their profound ignorance. Harrison Sterling performed his market research to identify the most ruthless, efficient private equity firm in Chicago capable of absorbing toxic debt. He selected Thorn and Elise Capital. He drafted a pleading email to the managing partner. He has zero comprehension that the Elise operating this multi-million-dollar firm is the same humiliated girl he awkwardly shook hands with at the Drake Hotel. He does not realize he is asking the discarded daughter to bail out the patriarch. If Harrison is reaching out to a distressed asset specialist like my firm, the situation is far worse than I previously calculated from the public filings. Traditional banks have already rejected them. Standard venture capital firms have reviewed the books and sprinted in the opposite direction. They have exhausted conventional rescue avenues. My father is standing on the brink of total financial collapse. The prime commercial properties he leveraged to fund Connor's ego are teetering on the edge of foreclosure. Richard William is facing the systematic dismantling of his entire legacy. Let me pause for a moment and ask you a genuine question. If the people who threw you away to protect their fragile public image suddenly stumbled into your territory and handed you the power to destroy them, what would you do? Would you ignore the email and let them drown in their own incompetence? Would you call them immediately to rub your success in their faces? Or would you do what I did? I want to know your answer, so drop it in the comments right now. I return to my desk. I sit down and place my hands flat against the cool mahogany surface. Revealing my identity right now would provide a fleeting spike of vindication. It would startle Harrison and terrify my father. But fleeting vindication is a cheap commodity. I do not deal in cheap commodities. I deal in leverage. If I reject the proposal outright, they will simply move down the list to the next private equity firm. They will continue to hide their failure behind closed doors. I need to see the unvarnished truth. I need to possess the internal financial ledgers, the debt schedules, and the explicit documentation of their incompetence. I need the receipts. I pull the keyboard toward me. I do not type an emotional response. I do not hint at any prior connection. I mirror Harrison's sterile corporate tone with icy perfection. I construct a reply consisting of exactly 3 sentences. Mr. Sterling, I write. Thorn and Elise Capital is willing to conduct a preliminary review of the target assets' financial disclosures. Forward the comprehensive balance sheets, the outstanding debt schedules, and the executive compensation ledgers under our standard non-disclosure agreement. We will determine our level of interest upon receipt of the data. I read the message twice to ensure no trace of human sentiment leaks through the text. It reads like a machine designed to extract profit from suffering. It is the exact tone my father used when he denied me a loan to save me from eviction. I move the cursor over the send button. The soft click of the mouse echoes in the quiet office. The message vanishes into the encrypted server, speeding its way toward Harrison Sterling's inbox. The bait is placed. The trap is officially set. I lean back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. The William family believes they have just found a potential corporate savior. They have no idea they just handed the keys to their destruction directly to the bad investment they discarded. The secure data room link arrives in my inbox exactly at 8 in the morning. I instruct my executive assistant to hold all incoming calls and cancel my external meetings for the rest of the week. I walk over to the heavy oak door of my corner office and turn the lock. The click resonates in the quiet room. I pull up the initial balance sheets on my dual monitors. In the elite tiers of private equity, you do not read a financial disclosure to learn what a company produces. You read the disclosure to discover what the executives are hiding. Connor has constructed a chaotic labyrinth of shell corporations and deferred revenue models to obscure his terminal cash bleed. But I spent my 20s dismantling corporate labyrinths constructed by men far smarter than my brother. I recognize the structural illusions immediately. I order a carafe of black coffee and begin the financial autopsy. This is not merely a failing business. It is a documented crime scene of supreme incompetence. I delve into the operational expenses first. Connor is burning through capital at a pace that defies logic. He categorized a monthly lease for an imported sports car under transportation logistics. He paid exorbitant retainers to strategic branding consultants who happened to share his college fraternity affiliation. He funded weekend retreats to exclusive Caribbean resorts and logged them in the ledger as synergistic team-building summits. It is not a technology startup. It operates as a luxury frat house hiding under a corporate tax identification number. Every spreadsheet exposes his profound arrogance. He believed the money would simply regenerate because our father had always shielded him from consequence. When I was 22, I scoured complex documents just like these to earn a meager hourly wage, hoping to afford groceries. I taught myself the precise terminology of corporate failure while shivering in a drafty studio apartment recovering from surgery. My father forced me into that crucible. Now I apply those exact survival skills from a leather chair overlooking the Chicago skyline. The irony tastes sharp and metallic. I print the most egregious expense reports. I use a red pen to circle the fraudulent consulting fees. The pile of physical evidence grows thick on my mahogany desk. I am not just evaluating an acquisition. I am grading the golden child. He has failed spectacularly. On day 3, I transition from the operational expenses to the debt schedule. This is where the true narrative lives. The first 40 pages detail the expected institutional loans and exhausted lines of credit. It shows standard reckless borrowing. But page 47 reveals a different class of debt. It is a predatory mezzanine loan secured through a shadow lender known for exorbitant interest rates. This is a lender of last resort. I trace the routing numbers and examine the collateral clauses. My heart rate slows to a steady, measured rhythm. The text on the screen outlines a truth I almost cannot process. To secure this final, desperate influx of cash, my father did not merely leverage his commercial real estate. He crossed the ultimate boundary of financial preservation. He listed his primary residential estate as the collateral guarantor. The sprawling stone mansion in Winnetka. The pristine house where I grew up feeling invisible. The property that represented his entire status in Chicago high society. He tied the deed of his legacy directly to Connor's sinking ship. He co-signed a toxic, unpayable loan. The math is undeniable and unforgiving. If this technology venture enters receivership, the lender will trigger the default clause. My father will lose his commercial buildings, his liquid capital, and his actual home. Connor has effectively driven the patriarch into total financial ruin. I lean back in my chair, staring at the highlighted paragraph on page 47. The silence in my office feels heavy. I calculate the total capital injection, $12 million. My father willingly threw $12 million into a blazing furnace to protect the fragile ego of his golden child. I close my eyes and remember the stark white walls of my hospital room. I remember standing in his pristine office, begging for a $4,000 loan to prevent my own eviction after emergency appendectomy surgery. He looked at me with cold calculation and asked for his return on investment. He treated my physical survival as a poor financial bet, while he wagered his entire existence on a son who could not read a basic profit and loss statement. I do not shed a tear. I do not feel sorrow for the man who is about to lose his empire. I feel a terrifying clarity. I spend the next 6 hours compiling the receipts. I organize the documents into a sleek black leather binder. I categorize the negligent spending, the fraudulent consulting fees, the impossible debt ratios, and the fatal collateral agreement. I tab every instance of financial delusion. This binder is not a standard risk assessment. It is an execution order. I place it in the exact center of my desk, placing my hand flat against the cool leather cover. I pick up my desk phone and dial Harrison Sterling's direct line. He answers on the first ring, his voice dripping with eager anticipation. He asks if partner Elise has reviewed the disclosures. I keep my tone clinical and detached. I employ the precise cadence of a seasoned predator. I inform him that our analysts have processed the data. I tell him Thorne and Elise Capital is willing to discuss acquiring the distressed debt. Harrison lets out a breath of palpable relief. He begins thanking me and suggesting dates for a preliminary conference call to smooth over the details. I cut him off smoothly. I do not do virtual preliminary reviews, I state. I require a formal in-person pitch meeting in my executive boardroom this Friday. I mandate that the entire executive team be present. I want the chief executive officer to walk me through the operational strategy. And because the debt structure relies heavily on external collateral, I require the primary guarantor to be in the room. I want Connor and Richard sitting across from me. Harrison agrees immediately, eager to facilitate the lifeline. He promises to coordinate their schedules and secure their attendance. I thank him and hang up the phone. The trap is locked. The countdown begins. But before Friday arrives, I am going to receive a phone call that proves my father has learned nothing in 14 years. The pitch meeting with Harrison Sterling and my biological family was locked into my firm's executive calendar for Friday morning. I spent the intervening days cultivating a state of pristine emotional detachment. I treated the impending confrontation not as a familial reunion, but as a high-stakes corporate autopsy. By Wednesday evening, I sat alone in my penthouse overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The sky above Chicago had turned the color of bruised iron, pouring a relentless cold rain against my floor-to-ceiling windows. The weather felt appropriate. I had just finished reviewing the final pages of the catastrophic debt schedule my father had created. I closed the thick leather binder containing the undeniable proof of his impending ruin and placed it in the exact center of my glass dining table. My private cell phone rested on the kitchen counter. Very few people possess that specific number. I reserve it exclusively for Sylvia Thorne and a handful of elite peers who understand that ringing my personal line requires a genuine emergency. When the screen illuminated and the device began vibrating across the marble countertop, I did not recognize the incoming digits. The area code traced back to the affluent northern suburbs of Chicago. A strange, heavy instinct settled in my chest before I even reached for the device. In my line of work, you develop a sixth sense for incoming disasters. I picked up the phone and accepted the call without offering a greeting. I simply waited for the caller to identify themselves. Paige, the voice asked. 14 years had passed since I walked out of his corporate office with a ruptured appendix and an eviction notice. 14 years since he told me that saving my life offered no return on investment. Time alters many things, but it does not alter the arrogant, commanding cadence of a man who believes he owns the world. I knew the voice instantly. My pulse executed a hard, sudden spike, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection, forcing him to endure the dead air. "This is your father," he said. His tone lacked any trace of warmth or hesitation. He spoke with the brisk efficiency of a project manager checking in on a delayed shipment. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not inquire if I was healthy or married or happy. He bypassed 14 years of profound estrangement and launched directly into his agenda. "I hired a private investigator to track down your contact information," he continued. "It was not easy to find you. You have kept yourself hidden very well." I stood in my immaculate kitchen, staring out at the rain-slicked city lights. The sheer audacity required to track down your discarded daughter using a paid operative just to extract a favor took my breath away. My father operated under the delusion that he could pause and unpause my existence whenever it suited his narrative. "I hear you are doing okay in mid-level finance," he said. That sentence hung in the air, dripping with condescension. He could not bring himself to acknowledge the possibility of my true success. In his mind, Connor remained the brilliant entrepreneur, despite bleeding millions of dollars, while I could only ever be a mid-level worker bee. Admitting that I might hold real power would require admitting his own initial assessment was flawed, and Richard William never admitted flaws. He needed to diminish my reality to protect his fragile ego even while he prepared to beg. "I have a temporary cash flow issue," he stated, moving swiftly to the point of his intrusive call. "It is just a minor hurdle regarding some operational expenses for a new development project. I need a bridge loan to carry things over until the end of the quarter. 50 grand. I will pay you back with standard market interest, of course." I listened to his confident practiced lie, and I almost let out a cold, harsh laugh. I knew exactly what that $50,000 represented. It was not a bridge loan for a new development project. I had just spent 3 days dissecting his entire financial existence. I knew he had leveraged his primary residential estate to secure a predatory mezzanine loan for Connor's failing startup. I knew the aggressive shadow lender holding that specific note demanded punitive monthly interest payments just to keep the loan from defaulting. My father did not need 50 grand for a business venture. He needed 50 grand to make a desperate interest payment and buy himself one more week before the bank seized his mansion. He was drowning in an ocean of toxic debt, and he tracked down the daughter he threw away to ask for a bucket of air. He waited for my response, assuming I would eagerly hand over my hard-earned savings just to secure a scrap of his approval. He believed the scared 22-year-old girl still lived inside me, desperate for a father. He did not realize that the girl died a long time ago, replaced by a predator who now controlled the very debt he was trying to service. "What is my return on investment, Dad?" I asked. I kept my voice quiet, clinical, and entirely stripped of human sentiment. I delivered the exact words he had used to deny me survival 14 years earlier. I fed his toxic philosophy right back into his ear. There was a profound, suffocating silence on the line. The confident boardroom rhythm of his breathing stopped abruptly. The echo of the past slammed into him. I could almost hear the gears in his mind grinding as he realized I had never forgotten, and I had certainly never forgiven. When he finally spoke, his voice shed its polished veneer and adopted a defensive, biting edge. "You are still holding on to that," he snapped. His tone shifted from requesting a favor to demanding compliance. "You are going to throw an old grudge in my face when I come to you for a simple family matter. Family helps, family page. Do not be petty about this." The hypocrisy was so thick it felt suffocating. He weaponized the concept of family only when it benefited his checking account. When I needed family, I was a bad investment. When he needed family, I was a petty daughter holding an unreasonable grudge. He wanted all the privileges of fatherhood without ever paying the cost of admission. "I am not being petty," I told him, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I am just observing the market. And right now you look like a terrible risk." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to terminate the call. I did not wait for his inevitable outrage. I did not listen to him demand respect or threaten my non-existent inheritance. I simply cut the connection and plunged him back into the terrifying reality of his own making. I placed the phone face down on the marble counter. My hands were perfectly steady. A strange calm washed over me, settling deep into my bones. My father had just confirmed every single reason why the trap I laid for Friday morning was not only justified, but necessary. He still viewed me as beneath him. He still believed he could manipulate his way out of ruin by exploiting the people he deemed inferior. He sat in his sprawling, heavily mortgaged house, believing he had just suffered a minor inconvenience by failing to secure a $50,000 loan from his estranged daughter. He had no idea that the mid-level finance worker he just insulted was the executioner he had to face in less than 48 hours. He did not know that his desperate plea to Harrison Sterling had landed directly on my desk. He did not realize that Friday morning would not bring a corporate savior, but a relentless reckoning. I walked over to the dining table and placed my hand flat against the black leather binder. The documents inside represented the end of the William dynasty. The countdown had officially entered its final stage. Thursday would pass in a blur of strategic preparation and quiet anticipation. Friday morning would arrive, bringing the fog, the rain, and the most significant pitch meeting of my professional career. I turned off the penthouse lights, leaving only the glow of the Chicago skyline to illuminate the room. The board was set. The pieces were locked into position. I was ready to welcome my family into my empire. Friday morning arrived in Chicago, draped in a heavy slate-gray fog, the kind of dense, damp weather that rolls off Lake Michigan and swallows the tops of the skyscrapers, leaving the city looking like a ghost town suspended in the clouds. I woke up at 5 without an alarm. My penthouse was silent. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, drinking hot lemon water, watching the brake lights inch along the wet pavement of the local expressways far below. 14 years ago, I was one of those red lights riding a freezing transit bus, praying my bank account would not overdraw when the city processed my monthly transit pass. I spent those mornings exhausted, terrified of eviction, and desperate for a father who viewed me as a bad investment. Today, a private car waited downstairs to drive me to a financial fortress where my chosen name adorned the top floor. I arrived at the executive suites of Thorne and Elise Capital 2 full hours before the scheduled pitch meeting. The trading floor was empty, save for the overnight custodial staff buffing the imported Italian marble. The quiet carried a specific weight in this building. It held the smell of expensive ozone fresh leather and the lingering adrenaline of high-stakes acquisitions. I walked toward the executive kitchenette to brew a pot of dark roast. Sylvia Thorne was already there. She wore a pristine ivory suit, her silver hair cut into a sharp, severe bob. Sylvia had broken glass ceilings in the 1980s when male executives openly scoffed at female partners on LaSalle Street. She survived that era by turning herself into a human calculator, a predator who fed on the underestimation of arrogant men. She knew the entire history of the William family. She knew about the Drake Hotel, the unpaid appendectomy bill, and the staggering financial ruin my father had orchestrated to protect his golden child. Sylvia poured a cup of black coffee and handed it to me. Her gaze was assessing, searching for any tremor in my hands or any softening in my posture. "Do not let emotion cloud your math, Paige," she warned me, taking a slow sip from her own mug. "Numbers do not have feelings. They do not care about your childhood." I met her eyes over the rim of my cup. "I do not have feelings today either," I replied. Sylvia gave a single sharp nod of approval. She understood that I was not walking into a family reunion. I was preparing to conduct a forensic corporate autopsy on a dying entity. I carried my coffee down the long corridor to the primary executive boardroom. I arranged the space with meticulous precision. In the distressed asset sector, the physical environment dictates the psychological hierarchy of a negotiation. I lowered the thermostat to 66 degrees, ensuring the room felt brisk and unwelcoming. I adjusted the automated blinds to let the gray diffuse light spill across the long frosted glass table, creating stark shadows. I retrieved the thick black leather binder containing the undeniable proof of my brother's fraud and my father's lethal debt structure. I placed the printed financial disclosures at the far end of the table. I positioned the binder precisely where Connor would be forced to sit. I did not provide branded legal pads or silver pens for our guests. I offered no water pitchers or glasses. I stripped the room of all customary hospitality. This was not a collaborative workspace. It was a sterile operating theater, and they were the patients on the table. I walked back out to the main reception desk. My administrative assistant, a brilliant young woman named Sarah, was booting up her terminal for the day. I gave her explicit instructions regarding the arrivals. When Harrison Sterling approaches the desk with his clients, you will offer them a seat in the waiting area. You will not offer them refreshments or coats. You will let them sit there for exactly 5 minutes, past the scheduled meeting time, before bringing them back to the boardroom. Sarah nodded, typing the directive into her daily security log. In Chicago business culture, making a desperate party wait 5 minutes operates as a calculated power move. It destabilizes their confidence. It serves as a stark reminder that my time holds infinitely more value than their crisis. My father utilized that exact tactic for decades to intimidate anxious subcontractors and nervous tenants. I knew how his pulse would quicken with every tick of the lobby clock. He would sit on the modern leather sofa, checking his heavy gold watch, his anxiety spiking as he wondered if the faceless corporate savior had decided to cancel the rescue mission. I returned to the boardroom and took my seat at the head of the long glass table. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit mirroring the exact shade my father wore the day he denied me a $4,000 loan to save me from the streets. The structured fabric felt like armor. I swiveled my high-backed executive chair around, turning my back to the heavy oak doors. I sat facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the fog swallowing the city skyline. I folded my hands in my lap and slowed my breathing to a steady, rhythmic pace. I sat in that quiet room, visualizing the structural collapse of Connor's technology venture. I reviewed the data points in my mind. The fake consulting fees, the luxury car leases, the yachts, the catastrophic debt-to-income ratio. I thought about the phone call from Wednesday night. My father tracking down my private number, demanding $50,000 to cover his shadow loans while casually insulting my career. He believed he was speaking to a mid-level finance worker. He assumed his elite social status shielded him from consequence. He had spent his entire life building a narrative where he starred as the infallible patriarch, and anyone who failed to yield was merely an obstacle to sweep aside. He threw me away 14 years ago to protect his ego. Today, his ego would serve as the exact mechanism of his financial execution. The digital clock on the boardroom wall shifted to 9:05. Right on schedule, the heavy oak doors clicked open. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, sharp and distinct. I did not turn my chair. I remained facing the gray horizon, tracking the reflections of my guests in the wet glass of the window. I heard the confident, polished voice of Harrison Sterling ushering his clients inside. "Thank you for seeing us, partner Elise." Harrison called out, his tone dripping with professional deference and eager relief. "We appreciate you making the time for this acquisition pitch." Behind Harrison, I heard the shuffling, hesitant footsteps of my brother. Connor cleared his throat, producing a nervous, stammering sound. He dropped something onto the glass table, a leather portfolio slipping from his sweating hands, creating a loud smack. Then came the final set of footsteps, the heavy, authoritative thud of expensive dress shoes striking the carpet. My father entered the room. Even walking into a desperate bailout pitch, he attempted to project dominance through his stride. They fanned out around the far end of the table, taking the specific seats I had designated for them. They stared at the back of my leather chair. They thought they were walking in to charm a faceless private equity buyer. They believed their polished smiles and country club networking could mask a $12 million failure. They had no idea they were stepping into a trap constructed a decade ago. I kept my eyes fixed on the Chicago skyline. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the chilled air into my lungs. The preparation was over. It was time to show them the board. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom clicked open with a sharp, definitive metallic snap. The sound echoed across the long, frosted glass table, cutting through the low hum of the climate control system. I remained facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray fog roll across the Chicago skyline. I did not move a single muscle as the footsteps crossed the threshold. 3 distinct sets of shoes stepped onto the plush carpet. I tracked their approach through the faint reflection in the rain-slicked glass. "Thank you for seeing us, partner Elise." Harrison Sterling spoke first. His voice projected the practiced, manufactured warmth of a seasoned venture capitalist attempting to secure a desperate lifeline. He used my professional moniker with a tone of deep reverence. He believed he was addressing a formidable stranger, a ruthless financial titan who held the key to his client's survival. I listened to the cadence of his introduction, noting the subtle undercurrent of relief in his breath. "I have Richard and Connor William with me." Harrison continued gesturing toward the two men flanking him. "We appreciate you making the time on such short notice. We brought the revised operational ledgers. We are highly confident we can demonstrate the long-term strategic value of this acquisition." The moment hung suspended in the chilled air of the room. This was the precise juncture where the past collided with the present. I placed my hands flat against the padded leather armrests of my executive chair. I pressed my feet into the carpet and executed a slow, deliberate rotation. The chair swiveled smoothly, bringing me face to face with the three men standing at the opposite end of the table. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, structured and unforgiving. My posture remained rigid, my expression devoid of any welcoming sentiment. I looked down the length of the glass table and met their gaze. The reaction was instantaneous. It did not unfold as a gradual realization, but as an explosive psychological detonation. Harrison Sterling froze mid-sentence. The professional, reassuring smile vanished from his face as if wiped away by a physical blow. His eyes widened behind his expensive frames. His mind raced frantically, searching its archives, cross-referencing the powerful executive sitting before him with a ghost from 14 years ago. He remembered the Drake Hotel. He remembered the 22-year-old girl in the cheap clearance rack blazer extending her hand while her father looked away in disgust. He recognized the facial architecture. The horrifying reality of the situation washed over him. Harrison realized in real time that he had just delivered his clients directly into a meticulously engineered trap. Connor reacted with the physical clumsiness of a man stripped of his armor. He expected to greet a silver-haired industry veteran holding a checkbook. Instead, he found his younger sister occupying the throne of the empire he was begging for salvation. His jaw went slack. The cognitive dissonance overloaded his fragile system. His hands lost their grip. The thick leather portfolio containing his fraudulent business projections slipped from his fingers. It struck the carpet with a loud, distinct smack. The sound reverberated through the dead, silent room, but Connor made no effort to retrieve it. He actually took a physical step backward, retreating toward the heavy oak doors, as if the floor beneath his imported shoes had suddenly turned to ash. But the true devastation belonged to my father. Richard Williams stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face at an alarming rate, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. His broad shoulders, previously squared to project dominance, slumped inward. His eyes darted frantically from my face to the brushed steel corporate logo mounted on the wall behind me. Thorne and Elise Capital. He read the words over and over, his brain desperately trying to compute an impossible mathematical equation. He was drowning in toxic debt, facing the imminent seizure of his commercial properties and his sprawling estate. 2 days ago, he had hired a private investigator to locate my phone number. He had called me demanding a $50,000 bridge loan. He had insulted my career, referring to me as a mid-level finance worker. He told me to stop being petty about an old grudge. Now that same mid-level worker sat at the head of the boardroom, holding the execution order for his entire legacy. The golden child he had funded with millions of dollars was currently shaking in the corner, while the bad investment he discarded controlled the banking levers. Paige. My father choked out my name. It sounded like a dry, fractured wheeze. The booming, authoritative baritone that used to echo through our childhood home shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He gripped the back of an empty leather guest chair to steady his trembling frame. "What? What are you doing here?" He asked the question, but he already knew the answer. The truth stared back at him from the opposite end of the table. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not display a smirk of vindication. Gloating requires emotion, and emotion signals weakness. I looked at the three men with the clinical, terrifying detachment of an apex predator evaluating wounded prey. I let the agonizing silence stretch out, forcing them to marinate in their profound vulnerability. I watched my father realize that his entire social and financial existence now rested in the palm of my hand. "I am the managing partner of Thorne and Elise Capital," I said. My voice sliced through the heavy quiet of the room, sharp and undeniable. "And I am the one deciding whether your family goes bankrupt today." The declaration landed with the force of a concrete slab. I did not raise my pitch. I did not shout. I delivered the facts with cold precision. I watched the remaining fight drain out of my father's eyes. The patriarch who had spent his life dictating terms to everyone in his orbit had just been reduced to a beggar in a tailored suit. "Take a seat, gentlemen," I instructed, gesturing toward the chairs aligned on their side of the glass table. "You have 20 minutes to pitch me." The command hung in the air. It was not a request. It was an executive directive. I watched them process the shifting power dynamic. They had no choice. Walking out meant immediate insolvency. The banks would seize my father's assets by Monday morning. Connor would face ruin. Their only avenue for survival required them to sit down and submit to my authority. Harrison moved first. The venture capitalist recognized a lost cause, but his professional instincts forced him to comply. He pulled out a chair at the far corner, creating as much physical distance between himself and the William family as possible. He sat down and opened his notebook, keeping his eyes fixed on the tabletop, wanting no part of the impending slaughter. Connor scrambled to recover his dropped portfolio. His hands shook so violently the papers inside rustled against the leather casing. He practically fell into his designated seat, pulling his chair close to the table in a defensive posture. He looked at his father, seeking a rescue plan, looking for the man who had always fixed his failures with a checkbook. But there were no checkbooks left. Richard William moved like a man walking toward a firing squad. His legs appeared stiff, unyielding. He pulled out the center chair directly across from me. The leather creaked under his weight as he sat down. He placed his hands on the frosted glass surface. I noticed a faint tremor in his fingers. He looked across the 10-foot expanse of the boardroom table. The physical distance was minimal, but it represented a 14-year chasm of betrayal, neglect, and profound arrogance. He finally saw the woman I had become, and the realization terrified him. I reached out and pulled the thick black binder toward the center of my desk. I unclasped the cover and opened it to the first page of their disastrous financial disclosures. I picked up a silver pen from my tray. The click of the pen echoed sharply, signaling the end of the introduction. I raised my eyes and locked my gaze onto my brother. "Your 20 minutes started a minute ago, Connor." I leaned back into my chair, resting my hands on the arms. "Begin." Connor cleared his throat. The sound was thin and unsteady. He reached into his pocket and produced a sleek digital presentation remote. His hands were shaking so noticeably that he dropped the small plastic device onto the frosted glass table. It clattered against the surface. He scrambled to retrieve it, his face flushing a bright, uneven red. A dark patch of sweat was already spreading across the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. The premium fabric clung to his neck, betraying his internal panic to everyone in the room. He pointed the remote toward the large monitor mounted on the far wall. A title slide appeared displaying a minimalist logo and a vague mission statement about synergistic networking solutions. For his entire life, Connor had skated through every challenge using his charming smile and our father's endless capital. He never learned how to defend an idea because no one ever required him to prove his worth. He simply existed, and the world parted for him. Now he stood in front of a woman who evaluated distress for a living. He attempted to launch into his rehearsed script. He began stammering through a dense thicket of empty corporate buzzwords. He spoke of projected user growth utilizing speculative data that had no basis in reality. He referenced market synergies and paradigm-shifting innovation. His voice lacked any underlying conviction. He sounded like a panicked college freshman trying to bluff his way through a final exam he had never studied for. I sat in my high-backed executive chair, resting my hands on the leather armrests. I allowed him to click to the second slide. It displayed a colorful pie chart, illustrating hypothetical revenue streams. He talked faster, his words tumbling over each other, as he tried to fill the heavy silence of the boardroom. Harrison Sterling shifted uneasily in his seat at the corner of the table. Even Harrison recognized the profound fragility of the pitch, but he remained quiet, hoping Connor could somehow pull off a miracle. Connor clicked the remote again. Slide 3 appeared. It showcased a dramatic upward trending graph projecting millions of dollars in future profit. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was an insult to anyone possessing a basic understanding of economics. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the cover of my thick black binder. I flipped the heavy leather cover open. The sharp thud of the binder hitting the glass table echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Let us skip the fiction, Connor," I said. My voice sliced through his stammering presentation. It was quiet, clinical, and devoid of any familial warmth. Connor froze mid-sentence. His mouth hung open slightly. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He slowly lowered the presentation remote. The glowing upward graph remained frozen on the monitor behind him, serving as a giant illuminated testament to his deception. I looked down at the first page of my highlighted documents. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command the space. I read the verified numbers. Your current cash burn rate exceeds your gross revenue by an unsustainable margin, I stated. You are projecting user growth, but your actual active subscriber base declined by 40% over the last 3 quarters. You do not possess market synergies. You possess an operational hemorrhage. Connor swallowed hard. Paige. He started trying to inject a tone of brotherly familiarity. The market is just transitioning right now. We are positioned to capture the demographic once the software update launches. I turned the page in my binder. I did not look up. You do not have the capital to launch a software update, Connor. You exhausted your operational budget 6 months ago. Instead of scaling back, you accelerated your spending. I traced my silver pen down a column of highlighted figures. You categorized a monthly lease for a high-performance imported sports car under transportation logistics. You paid exorbitant monthly retainers to 3 separate strategic branding consultants. I cross-referenced those names. They are your former fraternity brothers. None of them hold degrees in marketing or business development. Harrison Sterling stiffened in his chair. He turned his head sharply to stare at Connor. The venture capitalist had staked his own professional reputation on brokering this deal. Harrison had believed my father's assurances that the company merely faced temporary liquidity issues. Now he was sitting in the room while the target entity was exposed as a fraudulent vanity project. The realization that he had been manipulated into peddling toxic waste horrified him. Harrison recognized the severe liability this placed on his own firm. Connor wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You do not understand the tech sector," he argued, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Those were necessary branding initiatives. You have to project success to attract elite talent. It is part of the culture." I flipped to the 3rd tab in my binder. "Your culture involves renting a chartered yacht in Miami last month," I replied, reading the exact invoice number and the date of the transaction. "You logged an $80,000 expenditure as a synergistic team-building summit. You paid for premium champagne and luxury accommodations while your payroll account showed insufficient funds. You diverted investor capital to fund a vacation while your developers went unpaid." My father sank lower into his chair. The broad, imposing figure of Richard Williams seemed to physically deflate. He was watching his ultimate legacy project unravel in real time. For 14 years, he had poured his wealth, his prestige, and his undeniable pride into this son. He had rejected my pleas for basic survival to ensure Connor had every conceivable advantage. Now the irrefutable data laid bare the profound depth of his miscalculation. His golden child was not a misunderstood genius. He was a reckless fraud who had squandered a fortune on luxury cars and boat rentals. Every time Connor attempted to interject with another fragile excuse, I shut him down with a hard, undeniable statistic. He tried to pivot to his intellectual property value. I read the assessment showing his proprietary code was built on outdated open-source architecture. He tried to claim pending vendor contracts. I read the emails from those vendors canceling the agreements due to non-payment. I dismantled his entire 14-year career in exactly 4 minutes. I stripped away the bespoke suits, the expensive degrees, and the country club networking. I reduced his existence to a ledger of negligent spending and profound ineptitude. I laid out the catastrophic debt-to-income ratio, proving that the entity was mathematically dead. I closed the black binder. The snap of the leather cover sounded final. I interlaced my fingers and looked directly into my brother's panicked, sweating face. "You do not have a business, Connor," I stated coldly, delivering the terminal diagnosis. "You have a hobby funded by a man who did not know when to cut his losses." The silence that followed was suffocating. Connor stared at his expensive shoes entirely broken. Harrison Sterling looked sick to his stomach, actively distancing himself from the toxic wreckage on his side of the table. Then the denial broke. My father could not endure the humiliation any longer. His fragile ego shattered under the weight of the exposure. He reacted the only way a cornered narcissist knows how. He resorted to blind outrage. Richard Williams slammed his open hand down onto the frosted glass table. The impact rattled the coffee cups and sent a shockwave through the room. "Paige, you cannot speak to your brother this way," he roared, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. His voice rebounded off the high ceilings in an attempt to reclaim the authority he had just lost. "We are your family. I want to pause here and ask you a genuine question. Have you ever had a toxic parent demand family loyalty only after you caught them in a lie? Have you ever watched someone who treated you like a stranger suddenly invoke the sacred bond of blood the exact moment they needed you to ignore their hypocrisy? If you know exactly how that feels, drop your answer in the comments right now, because that specific kind of manipulation requires a very particular response. My father sat there glaring at me, expecting me to cower from his booming voice. He expected the ingrained conditioning of my childhood to override the power I held in that boardroom. He believed invoking the concept of family would somehow erase the meticulous ledger of ruins sitting on my desk. He was about to learn that the ledger demanded a final accounting, and the true cost of his investment was finally coming due. The air in the boardroom felt remarkably thin. My father had shouted his demand for family loyalty, utilizing the booming baritone that used to rattle the windows of our suburban home. He expected the ingrained conditioning of my childhood to trigger immediate submission. He expected the ghost of the terrified 22-year-old girl to surface and beg for his approval. He believed his sheer volume could rewrite the power dynamic of a corporate negotiation. Instead, his outburst hit the soundproofed walls of my executive suite and died instantly. I did not flinch. I did not raise my chin in defensive posturing. I simply let his unearned righteous indignation hang in the frigid climate-controlled space until it sounded hollow and pathetic. I turned my gaze slowly from the sweating, stammering figure of Connor toward my father. My brother no longer served as the focal point of this interaction. Connor represented a mere symptom of a much larger rot. The true architect of this disaster sat directly across the frosted glass. I locked my eyes onto Richard William. Under my clinical scrutiny, the arrogant flush of anger on his cheeks began to fade, yielding to a creeping sense of dread. He recognized the profound shift in my demeanor. I was not looking at a patriarchal authority figure. I was analyzing a delinquent debtor. "We stopped being family 14 years ago," I say. My voice does not rise above a quiet conversational volume. In a room thick with panic, speaking softly forces everyone to strain forward. The low delivery commands undivided attention. "We ceased being relatives on a Tuesday afternoon when I stood in your pristine corner office and begged you for $4,000 to keep a roof over my head after emergency surgery." I watch the exact second the memory strikes him. His jaw drops, the muscles in his neck slacken. The remaining color drains from his skin, leaving his face a mottled, sickly gray. He remembers. For over a decade, he had likely categorized that brief interaction as a minor teaching moment, a character-building exercise he graciously inflicted upon a subordinate. He assumed I had absorbed the harsh lesson and moved forward. He never grasped that his cruel transaction served as the defining fracture of our bloodline. You sat securely behind your sprawling mahogany desk. I continue keeping my tone surgically precise. You steepled your fingers together, portraying the wise titan of industry. You looked at my fresh surgical scars with zero empathy. And you asked me what your return on investment would be for saving your own daughter from an impending eviction. Harrison Sterling shifts uncomfortably in his leather chair. The veteran venture capitalist suddenly understands the catastrophic personal history underlying this failed pitch meeting. Harrison realizes he has unwittingly orchestrated a reunion between an unfeeling patriarch and the vengeance forged by his own neglect. The broker stares intensely at his notepad, refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. He knows he is witnessing an execution, and he wants no part of the fallout. I reach for a specific file resting near the top of my stack. It consists of a single sheet of paper extracted from the dense labyrinth of their corporate filings. I slide the master debt schedule across the smooth, frosted glass table. The heavy stock paper makes a sharp, distinct hissing sound as it glides over the surface. The document comes to a halt precisely 1 inch from my father's trembling hands. Look at the highlighted section. Richard I command, deliberately stripping him of his parental title. I force him to hear his given name spoken by a superior in a professional setting. His eyes dart downward. His hands remain frozen in his lap, refusing to touch the paper. He knows exactly what the red ink on that document reveals. That is the predatory loan agreement you secured 6 months ago, I explain, detailing the architecture of his ruin for the entire room to hear. To secure a final, desperate line of credit for this failing technology venture, you did not merely mortgage your commercial properties. You crossed the ultimate threshold. You put up your personal estate as collateral. Your sprawling mansion in Winnetka. You co-signed a toxic, unpayable note to hide the fact that your flagship asset was taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. Connor lets out a choked, ragged breath. He turns his head sharply to look at our father, profound shock written across his sweating features. Connor did not know the extent of the leverage. Our father had shielded his golden boy even from the reality of their mutual destruction. The patriarch had hidden the terminal diagnosis, preferring to risk homelessness rather than shatter the illusion of his son's success. You poured $12 million into a son who could not pass a basic college economics class without a $300 an hour tutor. I state, dismantling the carefully constructed facade brick by painstaking brick. You financed imported luxury cars and fake synergistic yacht rentals while pretending you were nurturing a visionary founder. You leveraged your entire lifetime of work, your entire social standing, and your legacy solely to protect your fragile ego. My father attempts to speak, but his throat betrays him. A dry, raspy sound escapes his lips. He looks at the highlighted debt schedule and then back at me. The boardroom bravado has evaporated entirely. He resembles a man standing on a trap door watching the executioner reach for the lever. I lean forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I close the physical distance between us, drawing his full, terrified attention. I lock eyes with the man who made me feel invisible for 2 decades. I let him see the cold, calculated product of his own parenting philosophy. The raw, emotionless ambition he valued above all else now sat across from him, holding the deed to his life. So let us look at the math. Richard, I say, mirroring the exact phrasing he utilized to deny my survival 14 years prior. You evaluated your children as assets on a balance sheet. You invested everything you possessed into him. You invested nothing into me. The tension in the room stretches tight enough to snap. The steady hum of the climate control system sounds deafening in the silence. I hold his gaze, refusing to let him look away. I force him to bear witness to his own monumental miscalculation. I want him to comprehend that this outcome did not arrive by a twist of fate or cruel luck. It arrived as a direct mathematical certainty born from his own unyielding arrogance. I have reviewed your pitch, I tell him, laying out the final steps of the evaluation process. I have reviewed your operational structure, your non-existent revenue models, and your staggering, catastrophic liabilities. I have reviewed your remaining assets. I pause. I let the silence stretch out until the atmosphere becomes unbearable. I let the seconds tick by on the wall clock, ensuring the heavy, crushing weight of the impending judgment settles fully onto his shoulders. I watched the desperate, flickering hope die in his eyes, replaced by the dawning horror of inevitable bankruptcy. I am rejecting the acquisition, I declare. The words strike the glass table with the finality of a gavel. There is no return on investment here. My father recoils as if taking a physical blow to the chest. The breath leaves his lungs in a sudden, sharp rush. He clutches the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "You are a bad investment," I finalize, delivering the fatal blow. The devastation on his face is absolute. The rigid posture, the country club arrogance, the unyielding certainty that he could always buy his way out of any predicament collapses inward. He seems to age 10 years in a matter of seconds. The profound realization that he has orchestrated his own ruin by funding incompetence and discarding capability finally takes permanent root in his mind. The reality of my verdict settled over the executive suite like a physical weight. Panic is a fascinating physiological response to observe in an individual who has never experienced true vulnerability. For my entire life, Richard William operated as an immovable force within the Chicago real estate market. He dictated terms to contractors. He controlled the narrative at country club dinners. If a subordinate displeased him, he ruined their career prospects. If a family member failed to meet his exacting standards, he discarded them without a second thought. He constructed his entire identity around the premise that he remained untouchable. Now the patriarch sat trapped in a chair he could not control, facing a judge he could not bribe. The air in the room grew stagnant. The confident rhythm of my father's breathing fractured into rapid, shallow gasps. His broad shoulders caved inward. He looked at the thick black binder on my desk, as if it contained a lethal pathogen. The illusion of his dynasty had been stripped away, leaving only a fragile, terrified man staring at his own terminal insolvency. Harrison Sterling recognized the scent of a dying entity. Harrison survived in the venture capital sector by knowing exactly when to cut his losses and flee a toxic investment. He did not utter a single word of defense for his clients. The distinct metallic zip of a briefcase opening shattered the quiet tension. Harrison began sliding his legal pads and gold pens into his leather bag with brisk, efficient movements. He did not look at my father. He refused to make eye contact with Connor. In the brutal hierarchy of our industry, Harrison's silent departure signaled the ultimate death knell for the William legacy. By packing his bags, the broker communicated that my father was no longer a viable player. He had become a radioactive liability. Harrison snapped his briefcase shut and stood up, effectively erasing Richard from his network of influence. Connor remained glued to his seat, paralyzed by the unfolding disaster. He possessed the physical stature of an adult man, but he shrank into the posture of a frightened child. Whenever Connor crashed a luxury vehicle or failed a university exam, our father wrote a check to make the problem vanish. He never developed the basic survival instincts required to navigate a genuine crisis. He simply waited for the rescue operation to commence. He stared at the frosted glass table, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence to defend his own enterprise. He expected his father to fix this catastrophic failure, just as he had fixed every other mistake. But his father possessed no leverage left to pull. Richard abandoned all pretense of executive pride. The polished veneer of the real estate tycoon evaporated, leaving behind raw, unfiltered desperation. He leaned forward and actually reached across the wide expanse of the boardroom table. His manicured hands trembled visibly. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the overhead light, emphasizing the frantic shaking of his arms. He stretched his fingers toward me, a physical gesture of begging from a man who used to demand compliance. "Page, please," he pleaded. His voice cracked, fracturing into a desperate, high-pitched rasp. "If you do not authorize this buyout, the bank seizes my home next week. I lose everything. I am 70 years old. You cannot do this to me." He was crying. Genuine tears spilled over his lower eyelids and tracked down his weathered cheeks. The great and powerful Richard William was weeping in the center of my boardroom. I watched the salt water hit the collar of his expensive dress shirt. I remembered being 22 years old, clutching my stitched abdomen, standing in his pristine office, while tears of terror stung my own eyes. He looked at my fear with profound revulsion. He told me to learn grit. He framed my poverty as a character flaw. Now I looked at his tears with quiet academic fascination. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I maintained a soft, measured tone, keeping my delivery surgically precise. "I am not doing anything to you, Dad," I told him. The word Dad carried no warmth. It functioned as a mirror reflecting his colossal failure back at him. I delivered the title not as an endearment, but as a final assessment of his character. "I am just not saving you from the consequences of your own choices." When a narcissist realizes their victim will no longer submit, they often pivot from begging to attacking. It is a predictable psychological defense mechanism designed to shift the blame and avoid accountability. Seeing that his tears earned no mercy, my father attempted to play his final remaining card. He tried to weaponize my own history against me. His sadness hardened into desperate spite. His face twisted into a mask of bitter resentment. "You are punishing us because you are jealous," he spit out, his voice vibrating with sudden, frantic hostility. "You have always been vindictive. You resent Connor because I supported his vision instead of yours." I listened to his accusation. I evaluated the words, letting them hang in the chilled air of the executive suite. They held no power. They bounced off my tailored suit and landed harmlessly on the carpet. He wielded the word jealous like a weapon, but his aim was entirely off target. Jealousy implies a desire to possess what another person holds. I looked at the trembling man beside him. Connor faced a future devoid of marketable skills, carrying a public record of profound corporate negligence. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain a spectacular failure to potential employers who would search his name and find only ruin. I looked at my father facing the twilight of his life, with his assets seized, his reputation shattered, and his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris. There was nothing in their dynamic to envy. I had built a fortress of genuine autonomy. They had built a prison of mutual delusion. He still believed my existence revolved around seeking his validation or envying my brother's fraudulent life. He could not fathom a reality where I had simply outgrown the need for his approval. He needed me to be a jealous child because the alternative, acknowledging that I was a superior strategist who had fairly defeated him, proved too devastating to accept. I looked at Connor, who was still trembling in silence, offering zero defense for himself, and then back to the crying patriarch. I felt no anger. I felt no urge to defend my achievements or list my accolades. The need to prove myself to this man had died a decade ago, in a cheap apartment above a laundromat. "I am not punishing you," I stated with calm finality. "I am setting a boundary, a business boundary and a personal one. The meeting is over." I reached out and pressed the silver button on my desk console. The digital chime rang clearly through the room, cutting off any further debate. "Security," I instructed the intercom microphone. "Oh, please escort our guests to the elevators." The heavy oak doors opened almost immediately. Two uniformed guards stepped into the room, their presence formal and uncompromising. The arrival of the security personnel finalized the transaction. In the corporate hierarchy of the city, being escorted out by guards represents the ultimate loss of status. It strips a person of their executive dignity and reduces them to a trespassing nuisance. My father had spent 40 years ensuring he was the individual requesting the escorts. Now he found himself on the receiving end of the protocol. My father realized the negotiation had officially terminated. There would be no second chances, no revised pitches, and no miraculous reprieves. A visceral sob escaped his throat. It was an ugly, raw sound. The sound of a man watching his empire turn to dust before his very eyes. He struggled to stand up, his knees buckling slightly under the weight of his impending bankruptcy. He looked around the room one last time, searching for a shred of sympathy that did not exist. The guards moved forward with professional efficiency, guiding the ruined patriarch and his silent golden child toward the exit. Harrison Sterling followed closely behind them, eager to distance himself from the contagious failure. I did not watch them walk away. I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair and swiveled around. I turned my back to the room and faced the floor-to-ceiling windows. The gray fog continued to roll across Lake Michigan, swallowing the skyline in a dense mist. I listened to the shuffling footsteps and the quiet weeping fade into the corridor. The doors clicked shut. The room returned to perfect, unbroken silence. I sat alone in my empire, breathing in the crisp, cool air of total freedom. The Chicago financial ecosystem operates on rumor and ruthless efficiency. It is a machine that processes failure with breathtaking speed. Word of the disastrous pitch meeting spread through the executive corridors of LaSalle Street before the weekend concluded. By Tuesday morning, the creditors descended like a flock of starving birds. Connor surrendered without a fight. His technology startup filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy less than 7 days after our encounter in the boardroom. Chapter 7 does not offer a pathway for restructuring or corporate salvation. It is a total unceremonious liquidation. A court-appointed trustee stepped in to seize the ping-pong tables, the imported espresso machines, and the ergonomic chairs, auctioning them off to satisfy a tiny fraction of the outstanding vendor debts. The shadow lenders did not wait for the dust to settle. 30 days later, the aggressive default clauses triggered. The bank seized my father's prime commercial properties in the West Loop, locking the doors and transferring the deeds. Then they came for the collateral. The sprawling stone estate in Winnetka went into active foreclosure. I sat in my penthouse and pictured the moving trucks arriving at dawn. I imagined strange men carrying away the heavy mahogany desk where he once sat and denied me survival. They boxed up the framed photographs of his golden child. They carted away the leather chair where he used to steeple his fingers and calculate his return on investment. The physical monuments of his ego were stripped away and sold to the highest bidder. Through the dense network of elite industry gossip, I learned the ultimate fate of the William heirs. Connor, stripped of his manufactured executive title and his endless funding, faced the harsh, unforgiving reality of the actual job market. Without a viable resume or a single demonstrable skill, he secured an entry-level software sales position. He moved into a cramped walk-up apartment in a far less desirable neighborhood. The poetry of his new existence mirrored my own brutal beginnings. He was finally learning the grit our father had so highly recommended for me. He spent his days making cold calls to hostile receptionists, trying to meet punishing quotas just to afford his rent. Richard William relocated to a modest rented condominium in the distant outer suburbs. He forfeited his membership at the prestigious country club because he could no longer afford the monthly dues. His peers stopped returning his phone calls. In this city, losing your wealth is an unfortunate event, but looking foolish is an unforgivable sin. He had staked his sterling reputation on a profound fraud, and the market exiled him for it. They were ruined, but I did not orchestrate their destruction. I did not sabotage their accounts or spread vicious lies. They engineered their own demise through relentless, unchecked incompetence. A month passed. The autumn air turned sharp and biting, sweeping dead leaves across the pavement. My direct office line rang on a Thursday afternoon. My assistant Sarah announced Harrison Sterling. I accepted the call. The veteran venture capitalist spoke with a measured, highly respectful tone. He offered a formal clinical apology for failing to conduct proper due diligence prior to our pitch meeting. He acknowledged the severe embarrassment of bringing such a toxic asset into my executive boardroom. He took full accountability for the oversight. Then he pivoted smoothly. He possessed a new legitimate acquisition target in the industrial logistics sector. He requested the opportunity to take me to lunch to discuss a potential partnership. I accepted the invitation. We met at an exclusive steakhouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It was the kind of establishment where politicians and hedge fund managers finalize handshakes over dry, aged ribeyes and pristine white tablecloths. The maitre d' greeted me by my professional name and guided us to a secluded corner booth, ensuring maximum privacy. Harrison arrived wearing a tailored navy suit, carrying a genuine portfolio of profitable data. Throughout the hour-long meeting, the dynamic remained pristine. He addressed me as Partner Elise. He deferred to my analytical expertise, listening intently when I critiqued a supply chain vulnerability in his prospectus. He treated me as a titan of the private equity sector, an equal operating at the highest echelon of the economy. Not once did he mention Richard William. Not a single syllable was wasted on the ruined patriarch or the failed startup. In the eyes of Chicago high society, my father had simply ceased to exist. He was a bad memory, a cautionary tale swept under the rug and scrubbed from the collective consciousness. Sitting across from Harrison, watching him present viable numbers with careful deference, I experienced a quiet, profound revelation. This was the pebble moment. The waiter approached our booth holding the leather-bound reserve list. I instructed him to bring a specific vintage of Bordeaux, a $200 bottle of wine. I did not order it to show off for Harrison. I ordered it for the 22-year-old girl who used to count spare change to afford a train ticket while nursing a surgical wound. When the waiter poured the dark red liquid into the crystal glass, I handed him my corporate card. A card bearing the logo of the empire I built from the ground up. Taking a sip of that wine, I waited for the familiar burning resentment that had fueled my ascent for over a decade. I searched my chest for the anger that drove me to work 100-hour weeks. I searched for the desperate, gnawing need to prove my father wrong. It was gone. The rage had evaporated, leaving behind a pristine, unclouded serenity. I realized sitting in that luxurious booth that I no longer cared about his approval. Seeking validation from Richard William was a flawed objective from the very beginning because his judgment was fundamentally broken. He possessed no ability to evaluate true worth. He bet his entire existence on a losing hand while actively discarding a winning lottery ticket. His metrics were wrong. His calculations were entirely incorrect. He was simply put a terrible businessman. We finished the main course. Harrison closed his logistics folder, seeming pleased with our preliminary agreement. He signaled for the dessert menus, but before the waiter arrived, Harrison reached into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek gray envelope and slid it across the white linen tablecloth. He maintained a neutral professional expression, but a distinct glint of strategic respect shone in his eyes. He told me his firm had recently acquired a portfolio of distressed commercial real estate debt from a regional bank looking to liquidate rapidly. The bank was eager to offload the seized assets at a fraction of their original market value, just to clear their books before the fiscal year ended. Harrison explained that his firm lacked the operational capacity to manage the physical buildings. He knew Thorne and Elise Capital specialized in rehabilitating neglected properties and restoring their profitability. I opened the gray envelope and withdrew the heavy stock asset list. The printed pages detailed 3 specific commercial towers in the West Loop. They were the exact same properties my father had leveraged and lost to fund Connor's disastrous venture. The bank had bundled Richard Williams' forfeited legacy into a discount liquidation package. Harrison was offering me the opportunity to purchase my father's former empire for pennies on the dollar. He did not present the deal as a poetic gesture of retribution. He presented it because the math made perfect logical sense. I stared at the addresses printed in sharp black ink. Purchasing these buildings would not just symbolize my victory. It would officially transfer the physical foundation of the William dynasty into my personal holding company. I would own the very bricks and mortar that once gave my father his unearned sense of superiority. I looked up from the documents and met Harrison's expectant gaze. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my silver pen, preparing to sign the preliminary letter of intent. I uncapped my silver pen and let the ink flow across the heavy stock paper. I signed my professional moniker on the bottom line of the preliminary letter of intent, Page Elise. I pushed the document back across the pristine white tablecloth toward Harrison Sterling. With that single fluid motion, I acquired the literal foundation of the William dynasty. The 3 commercial towers in the West Loop now belonged to my holding company. I owned the concrete, the steel, and the glass that used to inflate my father's ego. Those buildings housed the very executive suites where he once sat and denied me a simple loan for my medical survival. In a matter of weeks, I would hold the master keys to his former kingdom. Harrison offered a respectful nod, gathered the signed documents, and left the upscale steakhouse. I sat alone in the secluded corner booth finishing my vintage Bordeaux. Colleagues and peers who eventually learn fragments of this history often ask me a specific recurring question. They wonder if I harbor any regret for not saving my biological family from total financial ruin. They ask if the guilt keeps me awake at night, wondering if I should have authorized that bailout. The truth requires zero hesitation. Saving them would have constituted the ultimate betrayal of my own soul. Bailing out my father would have validated his lifetime of unyielding cruelty. It would have signaled that his transactional parenting model actually worked. He would have taken my hard-earned capital, used it to rescue Connor from his own staggering incompetence, and immediately returned to treating me like an invisible subordinate. He would have viewed my financial rescue not as an act of grace, but as a required tribute from a lesser asset. I refused to finance my own subjugation. For the first 2 decades of my life, I operated under a fundamental psychological delusion. I genuinely believed that love functioned as a strict meritocracy. I thought if I worked harder, achieved higher academic honors, and built a flawless resume, my father would finally recognize my inherent value. I assumed success would act as the necessary currency to purchase his affection. I spent years running on a treadmill designed to keep me exhausted and compliant. I was entirely incorrect about the nature of his game. Success taught me something infinitely more valuable than his approval ever could. It taught me that I do not want the love of people who require me to buy it. Conditional affection is a depreciating asset, and I no longer deal in bad investments. I left the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp autumn evening. The Chicago air carried the sharp, familiar scent of the lake. I walked the few short blocks to my luxury high-rise building. The doorman greeted me by name, offering a warm, familiar smile. The private elevator glided smoothly up to the top floor. I unlocked my door and stepped into my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the dark, restless expanse of Lake Michigan. The city lights reflected on the black water, creating a sprawling, glittering canvas. This space belongs to me. No one can threaten me with eviction. No one can leverage my need for shelter against my compliance. The silence in my penthouse is not the tense, suffocating quiet of my childhood home, where we all waited for my father's temper to detonate. The silence here is rich, peaceful, and unburdened. I moved into the pristine kitchen to prepare dinner. I poured a glass of sparkling water and began arranging ingredients on the marble island. The intercom chimed softly. The doorman announced my guest. A few minutes later, Sylvia Thorne stepped into my foyer. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and carried a vintage bottle of Pinot Noir. Sylvia does not share my genetics. We share something much stronger and far more reliable. We share mutual respect forged in the crucible of high-stakes finance. She took a seat at the kitchen island, unwinding her silk scarf. We discussed global markets, upcoming acquisitions, and the shifting landscape of private equity. We laughed about a particularly arrogant hedge fund manager we outmaneuvered earlier that week. We did not discuss my father. We did not discuss Connor. They are entirely irrelevant to our trajectory. Sylvia values my mind, my fierce loyalty, and my uncompromising character. She does not demand blind obedience or performative gratitude. When I speak, she listens. When she offers guidance, I absorb it. This is what true family feels like. It is a partnership of equals built on a foundation of unshakable trust. I realized, looking at my mentor across the kitchen island, that the profound anger that fueled my ascent for over a decade had evaporated. The burning resentment morphed into a quiet, clinical apathy. Apathy is the true opposite of love. I simply do not care what Richard William thinks of me anymore. His judgment is flawed and his metrics are permanently broken. If you are watching this video, you might recognize the structural unfairness of my early life. You might occupy the role of the scapegoat in your own family dynamic. You might be the one working twice as hard for a fraction of the recognition. You might be the daughter or son who handles the heavy responsibilities, carries the emotional burdens, and receives nothing but sharp criticism in return. Meanwhile, you watch a golden child receive endless praise and endless funding for basic minimal competence. I know the profound, bone-deep exhaustion that accompanies that role. I know the quiet, desperate hope that one day your toxic parents will wake up and realize your true worth. I know how much it hurts to stand in the shadow of someone who shines only because they are standing on your shoulders. I need you to hear this truth and let it settle deep into your consciousness. Stop waiting for an epiphany that will never arrive. Stop trying to prove your return on investment to people who are spiritually bankrupt. You cannot balance a ledger with individuals who constantly rewrite the math to ensure you always owe them. Their inability to see your immense value is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is a stark reflection of their profound limitation. They thrive on keeping you off balance. They need you to feel small so they can feel large. The moment you stop playing their rigged game, their entire power structure collapses. You must gather your strength and step out of their toxic ecosystem. Channel your frustration into your own personal development. Use the grit they forced you to learn and apply it to building your own empire. Focus fiercely on your education, your career, your mental health, and your financial independence. Financial independence is the ultimate shield against manipulation. When you control your own resources, they can no longer control your choices. Build your own table. When the seating arrangements at their table require you to shrink yourself to fit in, you must walk away and construct a new dining room. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your victories instead of minimizing them. Find mentors who challenge you to grow. Cultivate friendships that offer unconditional support. Invest every ounce of your energy into yourself. Become untouchable. Become so undeniable that their negative opinions fade into irrelevant background noise. When they finally realize what they lost, and they always do, make sure you are too busy counting your own success to care about their regret. They will reach out when their golden children inevitably fail. They will suddenly remember your high level of competence when they require a savior. They will attempt to invoke the sacred concept of family loyalty to extract resources from the very person they casually discarded. They will send text messages, they will leave voicemails, and they will demand your attention. When that day comes, you will look at them with the quiet, clinical detachment of someone who knows the true market value of peace. You will recognize their desperation for what it is. You will politely decline the transaction. You will protect the beautiful, peaceful life you built from the ashes of their rejection. You are not a liability. You are not a secondary option. You are not a bad investment. You are the entire market. You dictate the terms of your own existence. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Paige, and the market is finally closed.
Picture a sprawling mahogany dining table in an upscale American neighborhood. The crystal glasses catch the soft evening light, and the conversations hum with casual mentions of Ivy League early acceptances, elite summer internships, and quarterly earnings. On the surface, this tableau represents the American dream fully realized. Yet beneath the polished veneer, a quiet, pervasive tragedy often unfolds. We navigate a society that reveres the hustle, where individualism, fierce competition, and climbing the corporate ladder are woven deeply into our cultural DNA. In this relentless pursuit of outward perfection, too many parents inadvertently transform their sacred homes into extensions of the boardroom. They begin to manage their families like financial portfolios, measuring the worth of their own flesh and blood through the cold, calculating lens of a return on investment. The stories we tell and the shattered families we examine all point to a singular, devastating error: the transactional nature of modern affection. We see it clearly in the creation of the golden child. This is the son or daughter adorned with endless accolades, molded to reflect the parents' unfulfilled ambitions, existing to feed their pride at country club dinners and networking galas. This child is viewed as a high-yield asset protected at all costs. Then there is the other side of the ledger, the quiet child, the different child, the one deemed a liability or a burden simply because their path does not align with a meticulously crafted blueprint of societal prestige. When a parent's care hinges on test scores, job titles, or public validation, it ceases to be love. It becomes an exercise in ego. True morality in parenting demands something far more profound, yet inherently simple, unconditional compassion. A child is not a trophy designed to compensate for our own internal insecurities. A family should function as a secure harbor against the storms of the world, not an arena where human value is calculated by a price tag. We must also reckon with the illusion of manufactured success. There is a distinct lack of wisdom in the way we attempt to pave the roads for our favored children. Many parents operate under the flawed belief that throwing money at mistakes, hiring expensive fixers to cover up incompetence, or shielding a child from every natural consequence will guarantee their triumph. Yet time and again, this overindulgence yields a fragile harvest. The pampered children grow brittle, entitled, and entirely unequipped to navigate the inevitable friction of reality. They crumble the moment the artificial safety net is withdrawn. Conversely, look at the children who were cast out into the cold, the ones who were explicitly told they held no value. They did not succumb to their rejection. Instead, they transformed their profound suffering into a forge. Working late-night shifts, sleeping mere hours a day, teaching themselves the mechanics of survival. This effort transcends climbing the socioeconomic ladder. It is a rigorous spiritual journey of self-mastery. True wisdom lies in recognizing the law of cause and effect. Hardship often provides the fertile soil required to grow true greatness. Our role as parents is not to force our children into pre-cut societal molds, but to possess the clarity to see and nurture the hidden potential within them, honoring their unique, unscripted paths. The highest form of resilience found in these fractured narratives is never rooted in vengeance. When the rejected children return to the spotlight, they do not come back to break windows or burn down the estates of their youth. They return to draw a firm line in the sand, to speak the unvarnished truth, and to walk away on their own terms. They demonstrate that ultimate power lies in setting boundaries and practicing the quiet, difficult art of letting go. Walking away from toxicity is a pure declaration of freedom. For the parents who realize their catastrophic errors late in the game, the true test of courage is not offering a bribe or weaving a new lie to save face. True resilience for a parent is the terrifying, humbling act of looking into the eyes of the child they alienated and saying, "I failed you," without a single excuse or caveat attached. We must stop projecting our past anxieties onto the next generation. We must heal our own deep-seated wounds before we try to shape a developing mind. Embracing this awareness requires a fundamental shift in how we view our legacy in American culture. We must acknowledge the fleeting nature of it all. The corner offices, the sprawling mansions, the hushed reverence of high society, these are illusions that can evaporate in a single economic downturn or public scandal. When the curtain falls and the titles are stripped away, the only things that remain in your hands are the authentic bonds you cultivated and the peace within your own soul. Children do not owe us a lifelong debt for bringing them into this world. The concept of familial duty is not a loan waiting to be repaid with interest. Parents are meant to be guides providing the steady, secure runway from which a child can take flight. When you give without the expectation of a return, you foster a connection that endures far beyond any corporate balance sheet. If you find yourself reflecting on your own journey on the boundaries you need to set, or the generational healing you wish to begin, I invite you to join our community. Follow the channel Eva Tells Stories for more narratives that explore the complex, beautiful, and sometimes painful realities of human connection. We share stories that challenge us to look deeper and build stronger, more authentic lives together. As the evening light fades over the quiet suburban streets, casting long, sharp shadows through the windows of seemingly perfect houses, one must wonder what truly goes on behind those closed doors. Society will always keep its metrics, credit limits, prestigious degrees, the polished facades we present to our neighbors. But the real ledger of a life is kept in the quiet, unseen moments. It is recorded in the steady, confident gaze of a child who knows they are seen, or the heavy, echoing silence of one who knows they are not. Look at your own table tonight. Who is sitting there? And more importantly, why are they there? Are they performing for their seat, or are they simply home? The answers we find in that silence might just be the only inheritance we pass on long after the rest of the world has stopped watching.